Devon, are you surprised that the government are in such a difficult political situation considering the size of their majority?
Yeah, I mean, I think these reforms have felt somewhat rushed through from the very beginning. I don't think there's been enough consultation, certainly with their own MPs, and that's happened on a couple of occasions. So the winter fuel payment, for example, blindsided most of their own MPs, and I think they're feeling left somewhat politically exposed. So I think disability reforms take time to get right, to do them in a reform-led way, and I think a lot of Labour MPs themselves will be looking at these saying, these feel somewhat treasury-led to hit some sort of arbitrary savings figure and some arbitrary fiscal rules, when actually, most Labour MPs are probably for reforming the system. They just want it to be done in a way that recognises the needs of disabled people. And when you look at the worst impacts of these reforms, you're looking at people with serious disabilities living on the universal credit standard allowance, being left with if they lose personal independence payment, if they lose the health element of universal credit because they're no longer eligible. You've got people who are just as disabled as they were before living on less, and that rightly is unconscionable for a lot of Labour MPs.
Max Wilson, do you agree that there are lots of Labour MPs who accept there is a need for reform, but the government have politically just not played this well enough to be able to bring enough of their own party along with them?
Yeah, I think that is right. I think that the government has sort of pinned itself into a corner here. They've pinned themselves into a corner where they're faced with the political realities, and they've tried to sell these reforms as being absolutely essential to the economic recovery. And quite frankly, I think enough Labour MPs have now called the government's bluff, and they've chosen to pop their heads over the parapet and actually go as far as signing this amendment this early on is really something quite unusual.
But they kind of are reliant on these reforms for their economic policy, because the savings, the £5 billion a year, is essentially the headroom that Rachel Reeves has left. And so to not go through with them now would leave them with massive problems with hitting their borrowing targets.
That's right. That is the political and economic reality that Labour have now pinned themselves into. That's what I mean by them having so few good options now. They're stuck between a political rock and an economic hard place, because political reality means it's extremely difficult for them to carry on with what they're doing, but it's also extremely difficult for them to back down, because there would be huge political repercussions further down the line in terms of their authority. And yet the economic reality is still there. There is still an enormous deficit. The government is still committed in theory, according to Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules, for trying to bring down debt by the end of this parliament. And I think that you don't have to turn your memory back too long to the dark days of Liz Truss to see how markets can react negatively when they perceive the government of the day to not be serious about to re-establishing economic credibility. So the government is now left in this position where they're left with no good political choices, no good economic choices. So I can't really see what their options are now.
Deven, Liz Kendall, who's the Secretary of State who's having to put these reforms through, she has said she's in listening mode to Labour MPs. Is there a way that Labour can make adjustments to the welfare bill? Can reforms be done which can carry the Labour Party?
Yeah, so yes, absolutely. And I think part of, this amendment calls for a pause for the government to consider the impacts, the implications, look at alternatives, look at ways in which the reforms themselves can be softened. And I want to pick up Max's point on the politics of this. And yes, the government is certainly between a rock and a hard place. But it isn't the politics that matters really to Labour or to me, in the context of these reforms. These are people who are, losing serious amounts of money, which, we talk about hitting that savings target. But actually, the real risk is some of these reforms are counterproductive. So if you think about someone who's currently in receipt of personal independence payment, able to work and getting by okay, if they lose their personal, maybe that's one of the things that enables them to work. Now, I don't think, that will certainly be true in some cases and maybe less true in others, but I don't think the government's really convinced its own MPs that it's thought through the implications of this. And also when you think about kind of maintaining people's health and the knock-on implications for social care, if people's health is deteriorating, sometimes this money is being put to good, often this money is being put to good use to help people, stay healthier, stay active for longer. And if you lose that, then you end up kind of paying for it in increased social care costs, right? So, the concerns of Labour MPs here are absolutely real because they affect their constituents. And there's not a single, there's no one listening to the show that isn't going to know someone who's impacted by these reforms. It's almost certain that you'll know somebody who's impacted by these reforms because they're so wide ranging. That doesn't mean to say reform isn't possible, but it just means it takes time to get reforms right. A bugbear of mine in the context of this debate is the debate turns to work. You get personal independence payment whether or not you're in work, right? So that's not it's kind of an enabling tool for a lot of disabled people to stay in work, and yet we're talking about the problem is work. Now, it is for the limited capability for work-related element, but actually, and the one thing I'll say for this government is a lot of these, it's inherited an incredibly difficult situation. It has to do something about that. So reforms are necessary, but I think these reforms to its own MPs feel rushed, feel like they haven't been listened to, feel like the knock-on consequences of taking these disability benefits away from people.
Max, what's the political risk for Keir Starmer to be seen as a party that Labour's often criticised for being, which is just to spend on welfare, see the bill continuously rise, and not see through these reforms? There's huge political risk if they don't be seen to sort of reduce that welfare bill.
Yeah, there is. I think there's almost a structural challenge with Labour's reputation there, and I think Labour constantly has to refight those arguments to justify that they are actually to be trusted with the nation's finances. And certainly this government, when they were in opposition before they entered government, bent over backwards to make the case actually they can be trusted with the nation's finances. So I think that argument, that narrative is part of the decision making going on here. And certainly they don't want to backtrack on that. But I think it's more fundamental than that. I think that it's not just about, if you like, Labour's brand and about ensuring that that's carrying on, but it's actually about the personal political credibility and authority of Rachel Reeves herself, in that if she is seen to backtrack on this, then I don't see how she can have the authority to push through with any other reforms, be it around the benefits bill, be it any other economic argument. Then that in itself, if her political authority is shot, then that also has an impact on Keir Starmer. But I think that really what we're talking about here, I think Deven mentioned framing earlier on, and I think that's an important element here, because I think the framing of this whole argument has been completely off from the start. I think that what you've got here is the difference between the abstract versus the individual. And I think Deven has rightly talked about some of the way individuals are going to be directly impacted in a very personal way. And I think the reason why this rebellion is so big is because now it's 120 or whatever it is, Labour MPs have signed this amendment, because they are getting hundreds and hundreds of personal letters from people that are impacted by these changes. And so the MPs that are now signatories to this amendment, are, if you like, feeling the brunt of those individuals that are going to be hit by it. Whereas the government, I mean, understandably, because they're thinking about the national picture, the international economic picture, the financial arguments, as well as the political strategy. But they're focused on the abstract. They're focused on the need to be seen, to be taking the tough decisions on the economy, the tough decisions to get the ballooning benefits bill under control, etc. So I think that if they were to have taken a different approach on the framing of the argument, the narrative, then I think they would be in a better political place than they are now.
If I can come in, I don't think it's just framing. I think there's a real problem with how these reforms have been put forward, the actual kind of substance of them, if you like. So, policy and practice puts together an analysis on these numbers. The impact assessment hasn't been carried out really, in certain parts of the country or in certain groups of people. So we carried out the impact analysis for Wales, and it's one of the most heavily impacted parts of the UK. Northeast, Northwest, and Wales are the most heavily impacted regions. Serious double whammy impacts. So again, if you're taking this money away from the people in Wales and Northeast and Northwest and other parts of the country, that's also having a knock-on impact on the local economy, which again is had a serious impact on those MPs who want to kind of see their constituencies grow and struggle. And I also think that the time to properly reflect on alternatives to these policies. The root of this problem is the assessment, right? So when you go in and are assessed for disability benefits, it's a box ticking exercise, if I'm brutally honest, right? Can you do these? Can't you do these things? Whereas actually, the intent was always, what do you need to stay independent for longer? What's stopping you from working? How can we provide that behavioral psychosocial intervention that was always intended at the start? When you go back, 15 years when these sorts of assessments were first put in. That was the intent. They were never implemented in that way ever. And that's one reason why, how do we get the most points on these assessments has become part of the game that people, understandably play, because it's support that people need to get by, and it protects them from, the worst, roughest edges of the benefit system. Because if you get disability benefits, you are protected from things like the benefit cap. Now, I was involved in something, we did some analysis across London, and the Mayor of London today put out a press release kind of supporting this pause. And one thing he said in that release, which I thought was, we've pointed out a number of times previously, is if you lose disability benefits, you lose the protection from things like the benefit cap. So, places like London, that's going to have a serious impact on people's ability to stay in their homes.
Okay, let me get your brief predictions on what will happen. Max, first, will this vote go ahead next week? And if it does, will the government win it?
No, I don't think the vote will go ahead as is. I think the government will recognise that they are onto a loser here, and they won't risk going ahead with it, particularly after Kemi Badenoch came out. And I think she had an opportunity to actually do the Tories a strategically sound service by backing the government. But I think with their caveated,
I think she's offered her support with some conditions, as I understand it.
Yeah, with these conditions which the government obviously can't meet. So I think that she's done herself a disservice there. So I think that even now, I think that the government will probably realise that there's no alternative but to pull the vote.
And Deven, same question to you.
Yeah, I think the government can get its backbenchers on side, but only by, not in the legislation as it currently stands. It needs to look at the substance of this. It needs to deal with MPs' concerns of, people like me, our policy and practice, many others have been saying that there are some serious problems with these reforms. And if you think about the roughest edges, they are going to be unconscionable for the poorest disabled people. So, a pause either through the amendment or because the government realizes it's going to have to pull the bill and put it through, maybe in 6 months' time, having thought about it a lot harder.